I crossed across a little bridge. I walked into Venezuela, just 50 yards, and set up and started filming myself with the GoPro, pointing at the bridge behind me, and then I was going to pivot around and show all the people crossing. And I got about 10 seconds into that stand-up, and 3 guys came up behind me and grabbed me. One guy grabbed me under the arm, and the other guy grabbed me by the belt, because I heard the guy say in Spanish, take him, like grab him. And then I realized, oh my gosh, they're trying to take me, not rob me.
Hey gang, if you're listening to this right now, odds are you watch videos on the main channel and you've seen how important speed and accuracy are in a gunfight. That's why Active Self-Protection recommends the Range Tech Shot Timer. I'll tell you, it's the lowest cost shot timer on the market that we're aware of, Bluetooth compatible with any Android or iOS device. More features than any other shot timer. You can store all your data on the cloud for free. That's free. Native integration with Practice Score and a visual light-based go signal. Visit them at rangetechtimer.com, rangetechtimer.com, and tell them your friends at the Active Self-Protection Podcast sent you. All right, folks, welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am your host, Mike Williver, your favorite former Fed. With us today, a man of distinction, Chuck Holton. Very exciting life he has led. He is an author, adventurer, a freelance correspondent. We'll talk about what that means exactly here in a little bit. He is the host of The Hot Zone with Chuck Holton, a podcast you can listen to on all major podcast networks. He is a husband and father of 5. Chuck, thanks so much for being here.
Very happy to do it.
For those who don't know who you are or what it is you do, let's start from the beginning. What part of the country are you from originally?
Grew up in Carson City, Nevada, the son of a fireman and a nurse, so solidly middle class. Joined the Army out of high school, spent 4 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, right around the invasion of Panama timeframe and Desert Storm. And then got out right before they went to Somalia for the Black Hawk Down incident. And went to college, became a stockbroker for about 10 years. And had my 5 kids in there, and then realized that being a stockbroker would really not give me the life that I wanted, which was to be home with my children. So I left the brokerage business and became a full-time writer so I could write from home, be there with my family. Got picked up by a couple of news outlets when the war started back in 2001, 2002, 2003 to do some commentary on the war, because the stuff I was writing had a military bent to it. And they kind of liked what I had to say, and then came and asked me if I would be a producer for them, come and make television. And I said, well, I don't know how to do that. I've got no training. And they said, well, that's okay. Just stand in front of the camera and say what we tell you to say. So that's kind of how it started. And it sort of progressed over time to me taking over hey, that cameraman, I think I could do that. And the editor, his job, I think I could do that. And I was already writing the scripts. So before long, I was kind of a one-man band. And because of my wherewithal and inclination to go to war zones and hot zones around the globe, I kind of became the go-to guy for several outlets just whenever they needed to send somebody to someplace that didn't have air conditioning. And so that kind of became my niche. And the fact that I could go by myself and be a one-man band, made it much cheaper. So a lot of networks like that started syndicating my work and picking me up. So now they call me kind of a freelance chaos correspondent. I cover wars, disasters, fires, floods, earthquakes, whatever. And immigration, a lot of immigration. That's a slow-moving disaster. So anyway, I've been doing that for almost 20 years now and love it. Really found my calling.
Why the Army versus the Marine Corps or the Navy or something else? What drew you to that?
I actually tried to join the Marine Corps. I wanted to be a Marine. Actually, I had my senior year of high school. I skipped classes to watch this Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North stand up there with his hand up and just listening to him, I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a Marine. But when I went to the recruiter, I just got a really bad Marine recruiter and a really good Army recruiter. The Marine guy just wanted to, kind of give me rah, rah, rah and didn't give me any details. But the Army recruiter was willing to actually tell me what being in the military entailed as far as pay and benefits and things like that. So I ended up joining the Army, but I knew I didn't want to just do infantry or bullet stopper, something like that. I wanted to try to, I really needed, I think, I was 125 pounds when I joined the military, and I got picked on a lot in high school. And I needed something concrete that I could point to and say, you see that Ranger tab on my shoulder? That means I've got what it takes. And so it was something I had dreamed about as a kid, and I'm very glad that I did it. It was miserable, which is it's supposed to be, but it's good misery. It's character building misery. And I wouldn't trade it for anything at this point.
Talk to us for a second about Ranger School. I think the figure is something like 1% of all the population of the United States ever joins the military, or less than 1% is ever in the military. It's a vanishingly small number of people, and therefore people who know people who are in the military is not that large of a number. I've been around the military my entire life. I was in law enforcement and federal law enforcement, so having worked in San Diego for a long time, pretty much half the people I work with were either Marines or Navy, some Army, some Air Force. I've been to Fort Benning, and I've seen those jump towers, and I thought to myself, nope, not for me. So talk to us about Ranger School and what it means to be a Ranger versus anything else. I think a lot of folks think, SEALs, Rangers, whoever, Green Berets, it's all kind of the same thing in the mind of the average American who doesn't know anyone in the military. So what makes a Ranger a Ranger?
The special operations community is made up of those that you just named, and Delta Force, SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, and then there's a lot of ancillary units like the 160th helicopter, Night Stalkers, the special operations helicopter pilots. But they all have a mission. They all have a specialty. Now, there's a lot of overlap between all those units. So especially during the War on Terror, of course, there's no Bay of Afghanistan, so the SEALs couldn't do their thing in the water. So they cross-trained and did a lot of missions on land. But in theory, the Green Berets are teachers. They go to a country and train the indigenous fighting force of that country, and do some sort of more cerebral kinds of missions. And they're typically older, more mature soldiers that are on their second or third enlistment. And so they were designed to be that way. The SEALs specialize in operations on water. And so anything that has to do with scuba diving, parachuting into water, boat ops, stuff like that, that's their forte. And the Rangers are the fighters. They basically are the president's kickoff team. They used to say, if you absolutely positively need it destroyed overnight, call the Rangers. We're really, really good at wrecking things and killing people. And that's our specialty. It doesn't take, we're kind of a blunt instrument. If you have a hostage rescue situation, the Rangers might be involved in sort of securing the area around the target house. But the guys who go inside are most likely going to be either SEALs or Delta Force. Because they have more training on those kind of precision ops. So that's that sort of thing. In today's world, all of the special operations make up the Joint Special Operations Command, and they create these packages for every mission. So it might be a few Rangers and a few SEALs and a few Green Berets and some Delta Force guys all mixed together. But in the bottom line is the Rangers are typically younger on their first enlistment. They're very, very physical, very, very, into hand-to-hand combat. They probably fire 1 million rounds a year on the range. They're really into killing people and breaking things. And any skill that helps them do that better is what they train on during peacetime.
I was at Benning. Our agency happened to have our firearms school for firearms instructors at Fort Benning, co-located there. And we have, at the time, this has been 10 years, but they would have a Ranger as a guest student in every class. And I just remember the guy that was there when I was guest instructing was hyper focused. I mean, the guy was just locked on to whatever assignment we gave him, because we're like fat feds, we're not so squared away as this guy was. In every assignment we gave him, he did it with relish and with precision, and I was very, very impressed. That left an impression on me.
Yeah, the Rangers are probably the most disciplined unit in the military. You probably wouldn't find another unit in the Army or anywhere else that where a private E2 would stand at parade rest for a private E3. I mean, I spent 4 years in the Ranger Regiment and really didn't know the first names of most of the guys I served with because we all called each other by our last names. It's highly disciplined because if your sole focus is becoming experts at killing people and breaking things, you have to have a tremendous amount of personal self-discipline in order to direct that only where it needs to go and not use that skill for evil. And so if you got so much as a speeding ticket, you could get kicked out of our unit. They would send you down the road. Now, you asked about Ranger School. Ranger School is something different. It's just a school that's named after the Ranger Regiment, but it's a leadership course. And people from all over the military go to that course. It's 61 days, and it's the most arduous leadership course in the military. Arguably, the idea is to try to approximate the stress of combat and then teach you to lead men under that kind of stress. And they can't shoot at you to do that. So the way that they ramp up the stress is they take away your food. You get one meal a day for 60 plus days. They take away your sleep. You only get 2 hours sleep a night, and at most, sometimes much less than that. And they grade you on absolutely everything you do. They have guys standing there with a clipboard everywhere you go, and you even grade each other at the end of each phase. And if you score too low on any of those things, you're gone. And so the number of people who make it through Ranger School on their first try is somewhere probably in the teens, I think. And the number of people who make it through total, because a lot of people get recycled and have to do parts of it again, it stays right around 30%. If more than that start to graduate, then they make it tougher. And it's been that way since probably the 1940s or 50s, I think. We joke about, back then they used to just shoot you in the leg with a 22 and make you do a 12-mile road march every day. But that wasn't quite the case. But taking away all your food and all your sleep can really make a zombie out of somebody very, very quickly. And so it's a very refining sort of experience. You couldn't pay me $1 million to do it again, but I'm very, very glad that I did it.
John and I talk a lot on the main channel, breaking down these LE videos about force-on-force training, how important it is to inoculate yourself to violence and stress if you're going to be in a self-defense encounter or an offensive encounter as law enforcement or military. I've never been in combat. I've never been in the military, but I would imagine that 2 hours of sleep and one meal a day might be fairly accurate for someone who's in a combat group.
It's generous. Yeah, for sure. That'd be a generous estimate. Now, you mentioned that inoculating yourself to violence. One interesting thing that they're finding nowadays that I spoke with the outgoing commander of the Ranger Regiment a while back, and he said, one of the things that we're seeing with the people that are coming into the Ranger Regiment, remember, these are guys right out of basic training and airborne school, so they're young 19-year-olds, and he said, we are realizing that most of these guys have never been in any kind of violent incident in their lives. Now, when I grew up, we grew up having fist fights at recess almost every day. It was just kind of a thing you did, But these guys, of course, living in an era of zero tolerance policies for violence at school and stuff like that, they've never physically imposed their will on another being in their lives. And he said, there's something that we have to really train them to do. He said, it's interesting. One of the things that we like to do when they first get to the unit is we went out one time and we got a 150-pound pig, and we made a little pen and we put the pig in the pen out on the PT field. And then we lined up the new Rangers and we told them, all right, go in there and tackle that pig. Take that pig down. And he said you would watch them, and the pig doesn't know what's coming. Of course, he's just over there munching away. And these guys would walk up and they would reach out and grab the pig by the leg and then immediately let go again, because they've just the feeling of, violently grabbing another being. They've never done that. They've never had that. And the only guys that really did well were guys who grew up on a farm who were used to wrestling goats and chickens and stuff like that, or guys who had played football. And so, But of course, the pig enjoys it when you start wrestling around in there, and it was real good sort of intro into forcing your physical will on another being. But of course, nowadays they do a lot of MMA training, a lot of Gracie style jiu-jitsu training in the military, or in the Rangers specifically. We didn't get so much of that when I first got into the Rangers, but when you go to Ranger school, you get hours and hours and hours of hand-to-hand combat in the sawdust pits at Fort Benning, to the point where you kind of realize that what my body's capable of absorbing in terms of violence and what it's capable of doling out in terms of violence.
It's not just the military that's suffering from that issue of young men in particular never having been in any sort of violent encounter before. We broke down a video recently. I'm not sure it's aired yet, but there was a video of a police officer in Oklahoma, and he is called to this apartment complex, and the suspect he's interacting with draws a gun. And instead of reacting in a way you would want him to react, the officer puts his hands up and he's backing away and saying, "Please don't shoot me." That was one of the hardest things I've ever watched as far as a law enforcement video goes. So it's not just the military suffering from that. And we're hoping, I have a good friend who's an instructor out there in that neck of the woods, and we're hoping to change that mindset a little bit.
Violence of action. Of course, when you bring it into law enforcement nowadays, if a former Ranger went on to be a police officer and it was accustomed to that level of physical violence, and he probably wouldn't last long as a cop, because if you actually impose your physical will as a police officer, you're going to get sued and thrown under the bus by your city leaders.
So Chuck, talk to us about Panama. You were there for the Panama Invasion. That's something that I remember. I think we're about the same. I'm 50. I think you're 52 years old?
Mm-hmm.
So we're same generation, more or less. I remember when that happened, and it was big news back then. In the States. So talk to us just briefly about that. I know these things are never as glamorous as they are in the movies and around TV. I know working for the government that there's a lot of staging and more staging and hurry up and wait and stand by. So talk to us about the Panama Invasion and what your role was in that.
I parachuted in on the night of the invasion, right at H hour, parachuted into a airfield called Rio Hato, where the Panamanian Special Forces were located. There was a little bit of combat that happened during the first 24 hours, but we hit them with a tremendous amount of violence of action, and Panamanians really didn't want to fight. They were, I actually had some Panamanian soldiers say, "It's about time you guys got here and took this dictator out of here." So other than the sporadic resistance that we got and a few mortar rounds and things like that, it really wasn't anywhere near what we saw in the War on Terror. And I've seen a tremendous amount more combat than I ever, as a journalist, than I ever did as a Ranger. But it prepared me well to at least give me my baptism by fire and let me know how I would react under that kind of condition. That's the one thing that every soldier wonders about. If you spend your whole career training for combat and never actually go, it's like training for the Super Bowl, and then you never know whether or not you would have performed. So I was grateful to have had the opportunity, and it wasn't. We were only down there for like 3 weeks. We went down, knocked over Noriega. It took a while to get him kind of in custody and then get him out of there. But once that happened, then we pulled out fairly quickly.
Yeah, I have a friend who I can't name, but he was down there as well in some sort of, I don't know the specifics, some sort of special. I know Special Forces is actually a unit, but some sort
special
of
operations unit,
some sort of special operations deal or the other. And he told me, and it stuck with me, he was more afraid of the place than the people. Like, everything in Panama is trying to kill you, is what he told me. Like, the flora and the fauna are far more scary than the Panamanian military ever was.
Very true. Very, very true. Yes. Everything down here bites, stings, or is poisonous. And I actually live here now. If I had known that I was going to live right near the airfield that I jumped into, at least I maybe would have bought some land or got a parking spot or something down there. But we love it. I mean, it's a nice warm place to live. The people are friendly. It's inexpensive, but in reality, being here for combat was a different thing. And yes, he's right. The other thing that I was more afraid of, other than the Panamanian military was our own military. Not that we weren't well trained, but there are always a lot of friendly fire casualties in combat. And that sort of gets glossed over. Most people don't know that, but friendly fire casualties are huge when you go to war, especially with a military that's as lethal as ours is. And we actually had several people who were killed by friendly fire in our unit. That was the thing that scared me the most, was getting shot by my own guys.
I think a lot of folks were introduced to the idea of friendly fire incidents after Pat Tillman was killed, and there was that weird, I don't call it cover up, or where the military wanted to make it seem like he was killed in some glorious combat when it was actually friendly fire. And I don't consider a friendly fire death by one of our service members any less honorable than one, inflicted by the enemy.
Right. That's just born out of ignorance. Most people just don't have any idea what combat is like. And if they did, then they would understand that. But I don't think the guys who were involved, it was necessarily a cover up. It's just that Rangers typically don't talk about combat operations, period. And so they just didn't want to talk about the operation at all.
Sure.
I was privy to some information from that mission not long after it happened. And, it's just one of those things. It was not gross negligence or anything or incompetence on anybody's part. It was just the fog of war. And it is what it is.
You've also been a bunch of other places in the world, but you mentioned that you were in Venezuela, but you were barely in Venezuela. Talk to us about that.
Been to Venezuela a couple times, but I only crossed just from the Colombian side. Just barely crossed the border far enough to say I'm in Venezuela, because Venezuela is absolutely out of control. It's a failed state. And criminality is everyday, run-of-the-mill. It's not even news. It's just so common. The gangs, they're called colectivos, and they're highly organized, supported by Maduro, the president. He doesn't trust his own military, and so what he does is gives license to these colectivos and tells them, look, I can't pay you. I can't, officially put you on the payroll, but anything that you are able to rob, pillage from the people, that's your pay. And so they're actually pretty well paid because they just go out and take what they want. I was reporting on the immigration issue. There's millions of people walking out of Venezuela into Colombia, just because there's no food in Venezuela. There's just nothing. I mean, people are eating their pets, and eating rats and dogs on the street and things like that. So
I heard they were eating zoo animals at one point.
Yeah, zoo animals. They're eating everything. And so they walk for sometimes 15, 20 hours to get to the border of Colombia, and they go into Colombia to get food. But the money that they have in Venezuela is not worth anything. So it's a real desperate situation. And the colectivos control the border. And so every person who crosses that border has to pay a fee to the gangs in order to get across. One way or another, they're going to pay. So I was there reporting on that. This a couple of years ago, about, I think, 2018 or 19. I was watching, they had actually closed the legitimate border crossing. So people are just walking across the river, the Rio Suchiate. I'm not Suchiate. I forget the name of the river. Anyway, the river that forms the border between Colombia and Venezuela was just a creek, basically. You could wade right across it. And so they had put up these little wooden bridges, and they were thousands of people crossing the border every day, going into into Colombia to buy groceries and taking them back across into Venezuela. And I was there reporting on that. I was with a couple other buddies of mine. We were on the Colombian side, filming these people crossing these little footbridges going across into Venezuela, back and forth. And I basically broke all 5 rules of stupid that John Correa talks about. Don't go to stupid places at stupid times with stupid people to do stupid things for stupid reasons. And I was kind of doing all of those things, breaking all those rules. So just being there at the river crossing is not real safe. There are Colombian gangs also who control the Colombian side, but there were so many people around. I figured, well, what are they going to do in broad daylight with thousands of people watching, So we went down, we're filming this, and I was just trying to get a better angle on the bridge that was closed. And to do that, I had to go into Venezuela about 50 yards. And it's a big, wide sort of riverbed, rocks and sandbars and stuff. So, there's thousands of people around, broad daylight. I said, what could it hurt? So I crossed this little bridge. And the other thing was that when I had parked my car, I looked and I had a good DSLR camera and I had my GoPro on a selfie stick. And I thought, I probably only need the GoPro. And as my brain was telling me it's probably not a good idea to take this big heavy camera in there because it's very valuable and you're going to have both hands full.
Cumbersome, yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't listen to that little voice in my head. And I said, no, it's no problem. I'll take it. And so I had both hands occupied. I crossed across the little bridge. I walked into Venezuela, just 50 yards, and set up and started filming myself with the GoPro, pointing at the bridge behind me. And then I was going to pivot around and show all the people crossing. And I got about 10 seconds into that stand up and 3 guys came up behind me and grabbed me. Now, they didn't grab my stuff. They didn't go for the cameras. I was recording audio on a little audio recorder and I was recording the video on the GoPro when this happened. So I actually have video of the whole thing. But they, like one guy grabbed me under the arm and the other guy grabbed me by the belt behind on my back. And so I kind of thought they were screwing around at first, because they weren't trying to hurt me and they weren't trying to steal my stuff. So I just was like, hey, not what, and then I realized that because I heard the guy say in Spanish, take him, grab him. And then I realized, oh my gosh, they're trying to take me, not rob me. Mm. And then it was on. It was 100% on. I had rehearsed in my head, if I ever get assaulted while I'm filming with my GoPro, I have this, pretty sturdy selfie stick with a heavy GoPro on the end of it. So that makes a pretty good bludgeon. Mm. And I had actually thought through what I would do if that happened. So I reverted to the level of my training in that moment. And I smacked the guy that had me under the arm in the head with my GoPro and it broke the GoPro. They call that an action camera. Yeah. You can't even hit anybody in the head with that thing without it breaking. That's not an action camera. But anyway, but it made him let go of me for sure. He fell down and then I turned around and kind of pivoted around and put the butt end of the selfie stick into the guy that had me by the belt, stuck it in his mouth. Actually, he was yelling and I stuck it right in his mouth and he let go. And the third guy didn't have a good grip on me yet. And so I slipped out and just went 100% dead sprint for the border, 50 yards away. And it was the fastest sprint I've ever done in my life. And I was thinking just as I approached the river, how, this is going to make a great story, and because I wasn't paying attention, I tripped over a big rock and absolutely face planted, like harder than I have fallen since I was a kid, probably. It's amazing I didn't break something, but I did break my big camera because I fell on top of it when I tripped over that rock. And I skinned my knees up pretty good, and I ended up giving myself a black eye because I hit myself in the face with my big camera. And so all the damage that was done in the whole process I did to myself because I didn't I got distracted and didn't think through what I was doing. And it gave those guys time to catch up with me. They were chasing me. And so they got to me and grabbed me again. And I was grappling with them and fighting with them. And all of this took place, and I timed it later on the audio. It took 15 seconds, the whole event. The friend of mine that was there, he had stayed on the Colombian side. He was a pretty big guy. But he was trying to get across to help me, but it took him 15 seconds to get across the river. And so he jumped across the river finally and said, "Hey," and just, he never touched those guys, but they saw him and they let go and took off running. Well, I was just starting to enjoy myself. And this is, when you get your blood up, and you're ready to fight, and then the other guys break contact. Now I wanted to fight at that point. So I turned around and started going back into Venezuela after them, which wasn't a good idea. And my friend grabbed me and said, no. And I was like, come on, let's go. I wanted to get it on. But they went about, I don't know, not far, just a few, maybe 20, 30 yards back into Venezuela, and were yelling at all their buddies. And all of a sudden there were like 8 or 9 of them. And they turned around and came back. And then I decided that discretion was a better part of valor. And we went back across the river into Colombia and walked off. And when that happened, several Venezuelans came over to us and said, man, we saw you cross that river and we thought we should tell you that those guys that you walked right in front of those guys, and they were there to collect tolls from people. And they saw you walk by with your cameras. And I went back. My friend was actually filming from the Colombian side. And I went back and looked at his video later, and like an idiot, if I had just stood there for 30 seconds before I crossed the river and observed those people, I would have noticed that most people were either coming or going, but those 3 guys were standing still and were watching everybody else. And they were just right in front of me, but I didn't take time to look. So just that lapse in awareness. And so I would say my first mistake was not listening to the little voice in my head that said it was a bad idea to do this in the first place. My second mistake was the lack of awareness and not just taking time to look at what was going on around me. My third mistake was, taking those expensive cameras and stuff into Venezuela to begin with, and not listening to my wife, who told me, don't go into Venezuela. I've got a bad feeling about that. Don't cross the border. Just stay on the Colombian side. I could have done it. But I just, pride is what makes you do that. And I guess the last mistake was wanting to go back and actually fight those guys after they had broken contact. Not letting my emotion get the best of me when I should have used, as I said, discretion as the better part of valor.
There's a couple of things worth noting for our audience. One is that even someone as well-trained and experienced as Chuck Holton can miss stuff from time to time. So it's not like if you missed a thing or got yourself in a bad spot because you weren't paying enough attention, whatever, deal with that later, beating yourself up later, and handle your business. The other thing I think is worth noting that I thought about as you were telling the story is they weren't out for the cameras. The cameras just let them know that you're a valuable person, worth something to someone, probably a North American, probably an American. And so your body and your person would be worth more to them than, what are they going to do with the camera if they got it?
Well, they were going to take the cameras anyway, but they were going to take me too. And like you say, I was worth probably $1 million to them. I found out later that a Polish journalist had been kidnapped near that same spot at some point later on after my experience. And he was actually kidnapped and taken all the way to Caracas, a 15-hour bus ride, and then put in prison. He was turned over to the government. The government then rewarded the colectivos, the gangs, for grabbing this guy. And he was beat very, very severely. He was hurt badly. And it took him a month to get that guy out of there. That's probably what would have happened to me. And at that time, Donald Trump was president. I like to think that maybe Donald Trump would have picked up the phone and called Maduro and said, you got 24 hours to let that guy go, and I hope you don't, because we'll send the Marine Corps down there and mess you guys up. But it would have been a real irresponsible thing. If I had been responsible for any Marines getting killed because of an international incident that I created, I mean, that thing made the Drudge Report and all sorts of stuff. I would have felt pretty bad about that. And so it's given me pause since then when I've been in similar situations about, it's not just about whether or not I can survive this. It's about the other people that could be affected by the second and third order effects of what I'm about to do. And so sometimes when I think I could probably pull this off, I'll choose not to do it. Simply for that reason. I actually made a deal with my wife after that. I have on my phone, the welcome screen on my phone is a picture of my wife. And I told her on the last couple of trips, this is since that event, my last couple of trips into Syria, where I am involved in some real hairy combat. Before I do anything, before I go on any mission, before I do anything, I'm going to do, for number one, I'm going to pray about it. and I'm going to seek to see if I have a sense of peace about that from the Lord. And I'm going to look at this picture of my wife, and I'm going to say, is it really worth doing what I'm about to do if I never get to see my wife again? And that I think has kept me from making some bad decisions since then. I also want to say thank you to John Correa, because watching active self-protection videos, and I've watched many, many of his videos, has really helped me in many of the situations that I get into around the world in bad neighborhoods, because it's my job to go into bad places. But I very often think about those 5 rules of stupid. And I very often think about specific videos that I've watched where John has broken down key pre-attack indicators and things like that, where I'll notice something and I'll see a guy that takes an inordinate interest in me as I walk by on the street, and then he picks up his phone and gets on his phone and keeps looking at me while he's talking on the phone. And I start thinking, I remember when John mentioned that in this video or that video, and it's helped me stay safe in many situations. So John is doing something with his active self-protection videos that is absolutely vital for anybody who might find themselves in a bad situation, or just how to keep from getting into a bad situation.
You know, being in law enforcement for as long as I was, you definitely, you have either you pick up on these things or you're going to get hurt or killed. So pre-attack indicators being a huge one. Just being aware of my surroundings, but that didn't always translate to when I was off duty, oddly enough. Now, I would notice things other people wouldn't notice, obviously. Otherwise, you're not a good cop. But, I would find myself at the gas pump not paying any attention to what's going on around me or whatever. And it really wasn't until I retired and started making the videos with John and paying more attention to that aspect of it that I'm like, wait a minute, I need to get my head up and be looking around. Not paranoid, just pay attention to what's going on around me. That's my behavior has changed in the last 6 months since I retired around that sort of thing. So it's funny you should mention that, because he has had that effect on me as well. You've also covered. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I actually got contracted to do some security consulting because I do this around Latin America so much, and because I speak Spanish. I got asked by the U.S. One of the U.S. government agencies to come and train some local people that they were having to send into bad neighborhoods, or a bunch of neighborhoods in Guatemala and Honduras, and they were having a tremendous problem with these people getting robbed all the time. And so I went down there and just watched what they were doing. And they had to go from house to house to house, and they were kind of taking a census or something. And so they would go to a house, they would do their thing, and then they would go stand in the middle of the road and get on their phones and look at their app and figure out where they needed to go next. And lo and behold, they would get robbed. And so the very simple thing of telling them, don't figure out where you're going to go next before you leave this house, and spend as little time in those transitional spaces as possible. Well, I learned that from John. And that actually cut the incidence of them being robbed to almost zero, just by teaching them about transitional spaces and teaching them not to hang out in them. It's very, very good stuff.
Going back to what you're talking about the border of Venezuela and Colombia, I went to, I used to work for ICE for a period of time, and I was in the business of getting people who were criminal aliens removed from the country. And I took a trip with a partner to Managua, and this is in the early 2000s. And we get off the plane with our crook, who's handcuffed, and he was a gangbanger out of the Southern California area. He had a pretty lengthy rap sheet. And I'd done this before, where you drop him off and you hand him over to the immigration and customs people in that country. Well, I hand him over to these people. They leave the cuffs on, and I won't say what happened next, but they greeted him. They welcomed him back to Nicaragua in a small room right behind the security area. I think people that have never left the United States to go anywhere else have no idea how good they have it here. They have no idea the rule of law being what it is. But this is not the most awful, racist, terrible, unjust place in the world. In fact, it's far from it. It's probably the best place in the world. Not probably. It is the best place in the world to live right now. So having been around the world, I'm sure you would agree with that sentiment.
I just spent a weekend reporting on the smash and grab robbery sort of epidemic that's in California. I went out to Los Angeles, and one thing I noticed is that a lot of people are starting to wake up to the fact, a lot of these woke politicians are waking up and realizing that, oh gosh, defunding the police probably isn't such a good idea. And now that the violence is actually spreading into their wealthy neighborhoods, it's not just in the poor neighborhoods. They're starting to realize that, wow, we really had a good thing and we are watching it slip away simply because we have destroyed the concept of the rule of law. With the Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon actually he's all big on this idea of what he calls restorative justice, which roughly translates to making the victims the perpetrators and the perpetrators the victims. So the criminals who are robbing, pillaging, raping, they're the ones who are the actual victims. And so he's not prosecuting them, especially if they're juveniles, even for things like arson or sexual crimes. He's just literally not prosecuting them. And so there is no fear of the law. Not to get too religious on you, but the book of Romans, chapter 13, talks about that law enforcement are the agents, the king's agents of wrath against evildoers. That they are charged with a monopoly on violence in order to put down the violent criminals. But when you take that ability away from law enforcement and they are no longer agents of wrath, they're supposed to be agents of peace, then you really remove the teeth from the law and you remove the fear of going against the law. And so it's no surprise that we're seeing a spike in crime and violence around the United States, because in places where they have specifically neutered the police department.
I think the biggest thing, even more important and more influential than neutering the police, is this policy in a lot of these cities. And we stay as apolitical as we possibly can on this podcast and on the channel. Obviously, you know that. We let our Jesus flag fly pretty high. We try to stay out of politics. But this relates directly to people's self-protection. It relates to your active self-protection, is the idea that they're just letting people out of jail immediately after committing a violent crime. I've heard a story recently about, this was in, I can't remember what it was, but a guy, stabbed people a couple times and got out and turned around and stabbed more people. There was the case in LA recently with the Burlington Coat Factory where the guy was just running around the store beating people about the head with a bike lock. I can almost guarantee you that guy should have been in jail for something else he did prior to that.
Yep.
And
yeah, no question.
The idea of this cash bail is, bail is racist or bail is somehow unjust. No, bail's there for a reason. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. Second to that being, trying to handcuff the cops and keep them from doing their job. It's hard enough to do that job with all the tools you have in that arsenal. You start taking those away, it becomes nigh on impossible.
But I think the lesson for everyday civilians is simply that we can take a lesson from some of the countries that I spend a lot of time in, like Syria, like Latin America, in that down here in Panama, the police are small, they're weak, and they're very peaceable. You cannot expect the police to respond in a timely fashion if you get robbed. And so it's on you to defend yourself from robbery in active and passive ways, mostly passive. So essentially you just have to make your house look less appealing or more fortified than your neighbor's house, and they're not going to bother you, they're going to bother your neighbor. But if you take a lesson from my most recent trip, which is to Syria. I just spent a month in Syria. And if you go to some place like Raqqa, there is no government to speak of. There's no police force to speak of. There are military all around, but when it comes to petty theft, there's almost none. There's almost no crime from a petty theft perspective. And that's simply because if you go into a store and shoplift, the shopkeeper is going to kill you. Mm-hmm. he's just going to take out an AK-47 and blow you away. And there's nothing to keep him from doing that. There's no law to keep him from doing that. And no repercussions if he does. And that, of course, is not what we want in the United States, but it does speak to the fact that when you are ready, willing, and able to defend yourself, you yourself are a deterrent to crime. And so we can't really expect from our government that they should be able to stop all crime, but we've got to be willing to be a deterrent to crime. And that's why you don't see these smash and grab riots taking place in places where, like Texas, for example, where if you try something like that, you're going to get shot. And they're only taking place in places where people have no fear of retribution. And so if that retribution is not going to come from the government, then people have to be willing to bring the retribution themselves in a legal way. And I think John is really, really good about explaining to people how, what their rights and responsibilities are when it comes to self-defense.
One thing I can tell you about the criminal element, and it's universal. It's whether you're in Africa or Russia or here, is that assuming they're not, they haven't mentally detached where they're lost their mind, but assuming they're a rational thinking person, they're going to do, whether they realize it or not even themselves, they're going to do a risk-benefit analysis before they commit a crime. Is this worth it? Is it worth the potential time in jail? Is it worth, if you're in Raqqa, is it worth getting shot in the face by the store owner, to steal whatever it is I was going to steal? We also like to say that, no one's coming to save you. You are your own rescue party. Like you talked about popping into Venezuela, you realize, hey, no one's getting me out of this but me, and you took action and got out of there as quickly and as effectively and violently as you possibly could. You have been, in addition to being in Syria and Venezuela, you've also, as you mentioned before, you've done some correspondence from the Pacific Northwest for some of these these mostly peaceful protests that went on over the last few years.
Mostly peaceful riots.
Talk to us about, because I'm familiar with Andy Ngo, for example, and the assaults on, the repeated assaults on him, and the refusal of the media for whatever reason to cover it. You went up there doing
Speaking of people who have no fear of reprisals from the law, we have in these places like Portland and Seattle, what you see is a government who is actually supporting this kind of lawlessness for their own political ends. And so I can say that without political bias, just simply because, I was there when Ted Wheeler, the mayor of Portland, came out and stood with Antifa and got tear gassed by federal agents because he sat there and he stood there and watched felonies being perpetrated all around him against that courthouse. People starting it on fire, people vandalizing it, people trying to tear down the legitimately erected fence that they put around that, and literally would not let his security detail take him out of there until he himself had been tear gassed alongside them, so that he could rail against the federal government under Donald Trump, again, for purely political purposes. But they've realized that, hey, this is kind of fun. We can go LARPing out here and put on our plastic armor and things like that. And these law enforcement agents show such restraint. They're so professional that we can take all of our ire out that we have against the government on these human beings that are here charged with protecting this federal courthouse. And we know that they can't hurt us. We know that they won't take lethal action against us. So we can take potentially lethal action against them, but they can't reciprocate. And this is kind of fun. And so all I need is a gas mask and some plastic armor shielding my body from the paintballs that they'll shoot at me. And they can't do anything to me. And so they go out night after night and throw literally like gigantic fireworks in among these cops. I just have so much respect for those cops. I've never seen such restraint from guys who literally, they're badasses. They could kill these punks in a second. But it's very dangerous for me as a journalist to be there reporting on that, because as much as Antifa and Black Lives Matter like to rail against the police, they actually want to become the police. And Antifa especially, they're surprisingly well funded. They have radio communications. They have quick reaction forces. They have people to set up blocking positions to block traffic around the places where they're going to do their direct actions. They even have medics, there on hand. And so when you come in there and you're not sanctioned, quote unquote, by Antifa themselves, and you're reporting on what they're doing, they're going to assault you. There's no two ways about it. And the only way to get around that is either for them to not see that you're filming, which is difficult, or to make them think that you're one of them. And that's really difficult for me to do because I get mistaken for police. I'm too clean cut. I'm too old, to be part of Antifa. And so they peg me for a cop every time. And as much as I say, I'm not a cop, guys, I'm not a cop. They won't believe me. And I've probably come closer to getting my arms ripped off in reporting on Antifa than I have doing anything else, because they have no fear that if they bash me over the head with a bike lock, that they're going to go to jail. They're all dressed alike and nobody's going to know who did it. So it's very unlikely that anybody would get prosecuted if I get killed doing that. So I have to be very, very careful. And it's the one thing I really hate about this job is having to report on those, unrest here in the United States.
You know, what's funny, you said you're too old to be Antifa. That's right, because no one over the age of 22 would be dumb enough to buy into this stuff. But I think we've transcended a Republican-Democrat issue at this point, even a left-right. It's really far leftist, authoritarian, fascist people who are calling themselves anti-fascist, which is hilarious.
That's right. That's right.
And then there's the rest of polite, normal society that I feel like in the last couple of years they've tuned out. It's too much. There's too much news. There's too much bad news. And I think people aren't paying that much attention, but it's still going on. Am I right? It's still going on in Portland.
It is. Almost every night.
And no one talks
almost
about it.
Almost every night. Yeah. And it's one thing I probably should get back up there and do some more reporting on that, because it hasn't been in the news. Ever since, our new president got elected, it just sort of dropped off. The media chooses what it will report and what it won't report based on its political leanings. And it's kind of inconvenient that there's still these riots going on up there right now because it reflects poorly on the sitting president and his press corps. So it's still happening, and I almost wonder though if it would stop happening so much if we just quit reporting on it altogether, if we just ignored it. But because they're obviously in some sense doing it for the attention. But I really think it's deeper than that. I think there are some, like you said, very far left true believers, and they're starting to come into the Democratic left leaning neighborhoods who once maybe supported them. And so they're slowly eroding the support that they once had. But so far, the government, we just saw, like in New York, for example, this new mayor who's a Democrat who got elected on a sort of a pro heavy hand platform against the criminals because the rise in crime is truly alarming in New York. And so we're starting to see that shift. And I think you'll see more of that as time goes on, because they won't be content to just stay in the downtown areas, or they won't be content just to target businesses. They will not stop until they've targeted your neighborhood too. And once they get there, then I think they really are going to turn the people against them.
Yeah, I was in New York City. I was in Manhattan back in fall of 2018 for an assignment, and we were paired up with NYPD detectives, and they were in despair over the handcuffing of the law enforcement in New York City. Yeah. But that brings us to another aspect of your life that I think is really interesting. We talk about all these young people running around in circles with their hair on fire, buying into these sort of really far out ideologies about how this is the worst place on earth and it has to be fundamentally transformed, et cetera, et cetera. You've spent a lot of your time and mental energy and authored books on raising godly young men. So talk to us about that and what got you interested in that particular topic.
I look around me, and I've been speaking to church groups, men's groups, schools, businesses, for 2 decades now. And one of the things that I've noticed is that young men are in the United States especially are really lost. We're just seeing they're being taught at school that their natural inclination to manhood is unhealthy somehow, that there's sort of like dysfunctional girls. Boys are just dysfunctional girls, and nothing could be further from the truth. And so I had three boys of my own, have three boys of my own. They're now all grown and gone. But I realized, man, I'm supposed to make men out of these boys, and I've got to figure that out for me. So I did about a 3-year study on what is manhood truly. What does healthy manhood look like? And I obviously rooted what I was learning out of the Bible, but I also looked at ancient cultures around the world and the manhood rituals that they all had. I looked at a lot of older men that I knew that I felt like had it figured out pretty much, and I went to them and said, "What have you learned about becoming a man?" And looked at healthy societies, or healthy societies with healthy groups of men, or at least subcultures that had healthy family lives, healthy relationships. And so what can we learn from that? And really, I think what it comes down to is that our culture is moving further and further away from a healthy view of family. Boys these days spend a tremendous amount of time interacting with devices and not with people. Even in their schooling, they're interacting mostly with women, as far as being raised by women. Some of their coaches, even their scout leaders nowadays are women. And so 100 years ago, when a boy was 8 or 9 years old, he was out in the fields with the men, and he was throwing hay, and he was doing man things and watching the men and seeing how they acted. And so that manhood got passed down from generation to generation, but that chain has been broken. And so there's a lot of manhood knowledge that's being forgotten little by little. And you see that in the dysfunction that we see around us today. So even in those LARPing boys out there in Antifa, what many are calling these boys that, they don't get touched. They don't have girlfriends. They can't find a girlfriend. And that's because they spend the majority of their time in their basement playing video games or watching porn. So the rise of tremendous amount of pornography around us has really perverted our culture to a large extent, when it comes to boys' ideas of what manhood looks like and how you get a girlfriend and what that process is like. So I did a 3-year study on it and then wrote a book on what I think, not just a book, but a curriculum on manhood that I could teach to my sons and say, look, sons, when you start to ask yourself that question, what do I have to do to prove myself to the world? It's not in the tattoo you put on your face. It's not in the plastic testicles you hang from the tailgate of your pickup truck. It's not in the, driving your motorcycle 90 miles an hour down the freeway. You don't prove your manhood in those unhealthy ways. It's not even in joining the military and becoming an Army Ranger. Because that's, when I look back, I really joined the military out of my weakness. I needed something that I could point to say, this is what makes me a man. When in reality, what makes me a man is that I'm submitted to my Creator, that I know what honor means. I treat valuable things like they're valuable and worthless things like they're worthless, that I die to my own desires in order to provide for the needs of others, and that I engage in every area of my life, that I'm not passive, but I engage in the world around me. Those are the things that make me into a man. And so I wanted to teach my sons that this is the yardstick that you should measure yourself against when you ask yourself that question of, am I a man or not? And whether or not you get a tattoo, don't care. But don't do it out of your weakness. Don't get a tattoo because you think it's going to make people think you're a bad guy. You're a big badass just because you got a tattoo. That's fake. That's a facade. That's a scared little boy acting to try to convince people he's a man, rather than doing the work to be a man and to do good in the world around you. And so it was very powerful. And it's actually been my best-selling book. Out of 10 books I have in print, my book, Making Men, has been my best-selling book and the one that I've gotten the most feedback on, because it's really changing lives as guys pick this up and teach it to their sons and then write me and say, not only did it teach my son how to be a man, it taught me some things that I was doing that I was missing in my own marriage, and helped me fix some of the problems in my own, passivity that was cropping up in my life.
I heard and I don't know who said it. This isn't my original, but I heard somebody say, if you have a beard and a neck tattoo, but you can't change a tire, you need to shave and wear a turtleneck, because that's not real. That's just a mask. It's just covering up the fact that you feel terribly inadequate about who you are. A lot of that, and I don't want to upset anybody, but a lot of that comes down to frequently not having a good, strong, godly male influence in the home. That's just facts. Now, that is not to say that single moms who are single moms through no fault of their own, who try to do everything right, but end up being single moms, aren't doing a great job, doing the best they can. But you can't, in my opinion, you cannot replace that strong, godly male influence in the home. Chuck, I want to thank you for being here. Any closing thoughts before we part ways?
I just want to thank you guys again for what you do. I mean, this is a very popular podcast and YouTube channel for a reason, because it really does a huge service to our society. John is the perfect guy to do this, because he is wise and willing to put in the work to truly be an expert in his field. And it's helped me tremendously. And so I'm really grateful for a chance to be on here and hopefully add something to it.
Well, it's been very enlightening. I know I enjoyed talking to you, getting to know you. I consider you a friend now. So I appreciate you coming on, and take care.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot.
All right, folks, it's that time of the week again. It is time for the Gutowski Files, featuring Stephen Gutowski, our friend, who is the founder of the Reload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast. Stephen, how are you, sir?
Starring sounds, I think that's more appropriate.
I mean, I guess so.
The star of this segment here.
That certainly isn't me. So you must be you. If one of us is the star, it's not me, for sure. I hope your holidays went well. Everything good on your end?
Yeah, everything went well. So, safe and healthy, which is all you can ask for these days. And the Eagles just beat the Washington football team. Yes. So I'm happy, and you're not as happy about that, but
well, hey, if it weren't so entirely predictable, I'd be upset. But I'm much less invested in the football team than I used to be. I just don't get as excited. Plus, they've been terrible for 25 years, so that doesn't exactly inspire confidence,
Right. But you know how it gets into you as a fan. You can never let go of it, unfortunately.
Yep. So this week we are talking about what I think is a great story, but there's a twist. So I'll tell the short version of the story, and you can tell our listeners the rest of the story. So there was a woman in Illinois, and she and her husband were driving around, and some armed men approached and attacked them and were in the middle of robbing them. And her husband successfully used his legally carried firearm to defend his wife and his family and their property. Now, that story would just be a great feel-good story, but there's more to it. Why don't you fill us in on the rest of it, Stephen?
Well, it's still a feel-good story, right? I mean, just for the facts that you laid out there, the husband was able to heroically save his wife and himself during an armed robbery with 3 armed robbers, and during an exchange of gunfire, in fact. But the caveat here, the wrinkle that's interesting that you alluded to, is that the woman in question is the majority leader in the Illinois State Senate, and she happens to be a Democrat who voted against legalization of concealed carry in the state. Illinois was the last state in the country to allow concealed carry at all. It was completely illegal before. This was back in 2013. The federal courts forced them to allow concealed carry. And so even after that ruling, 17 senators voted against the bill that ended up making it into law, and she was one of them.
If you're in the Chicago area, by the way, and you are listening to this and looking for some firearms training, let me just shout out my man, John Pearson, who is a firearms instructor out there and one of the best instructors I've ever met. Back to the story. So Senate Majority Leader Kimberly Lightford, just so we know, we're talking about the Illinois Senate, not the Senate of the United States. So she is a state politician. She is the majority leader. She has voted at least once against allowing everyday citizens of the state to exercise their God-given right to self-defense. And turns out her husband is legally carrying a firearm. Now, hasn't been asked or hasn't said if this changes her mind on this topic, has she?
Well, we asked her repeatedly, tried to contact her office through email and by phone, and left messages and got no response. So we don't know if this incident has changed her point of view. Obviously, that vote was back in 2013, so it's been quite a while. Perhaps she's evolved on the issue, especially after this. But she's also a leading advocate for criminal justice reform, and there have been a lot of critics who say that this rise in carjackings in Chicago is connected to that, and she hasn't changed her position on that point. So that might give you some indication as to whether or not this has changed her view on gun policy either. Obviously she's a very powerful politician in Illinois, and oftentimes having a personal incident doesn't necessarily change your mind on policy. I believe Stephen Breyer was mugged at one point, I think, during a home invasion on vacation. The Supreme Court justice who's was dissented in Heller, and I don't believe that changed his mind either. So obviously there's an irony there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's going to automatically change their mind on a policy question.
Couple of things. I'm also in favor of some form of criminal justice reform. I worked inside the system for over a quarter century, and I can tell you there's some people that are sent to jail, and all that does is make them better criminals. It hardens them and it sends them on the wrong path. But there are most people who are in jail or prison really need to be there. We need to figure out ways to keep people in jail who need to stay. How many times have we seen stories of somebody doing some awful thing who really just should have been in jail in the first place and shouldn't have been out to victimize people?
Yeah, and there's no evidence yet. The police have not arrested these suspects. They did recover the car, which was actually a loaner car from the dealership, so it wasn't their personal car. But they haven't arrested anyone. So there's no clear connection between her criminal justice reform policies and this mugging. But obviously, it brings up the debate once more, because it's been a very big debate, especially in Illinois, where they've passed a number of reforms there that critics, not necessarily me or you, right, but there are people who are critical of that position, who say it leads to more crime, like these carjackings, which have increased recently in the state. So I think the fact that she has spoken out, saying that the solution there is not to change her policy positions necessarily, but to provide more support for disaffected young men who might be inclined to commit crimes otherwise. That was her explanation for what she would want to see done about the situation on a policy level. So I'm just saying that because she got robbed and her husband used his legal gun to defend them doesn't necessarily mean that she's changed her position on guns at all.
Yeah, and I think, let's be honest, Republican or Democrat, it's hard for someone in her position to retain the support of her party and go against them on something as fundamental as gun rights or criminal justice reform. It's just not feasible for her politically, for her career. She's going to get primaried next time if she does switch up, I would imagine, on a topic this sensitive.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, obviously there's a range of policies that you could support. She might not be as opposed to concealed carry today as she was when she voted against legalization back in 2013, because there's been a lot of time to see the effects, and the politics have changed on concealed carry quite a bit since then. Obviously, we've seen a liberalization on laws of dealing with regulating the carrying of guns in the United States just throughout the country. And so her current policy might not be the same. I just think that the point here, like you're saying, is politicians are less inclined to make sudden radical policy position changes based on something that happened to them, because that's not how they formulate their points of view in terms of how they vote or what bills they support. They don't go off of their personal experience. Obviously, some that plays into it. It's just that I know a lot of people are going to look at a story like this and think, well, now she has to change her mind because she sees the benefits firsthand of legal concealed carry. And I don't know that that's going to happen here. Is all I'm saying. Yes, I think most people can see why she might make sense for her to change her mind. But yeah, like you mentioned there's a lot more that goes into what a position a politician takes, especially one in a prominent leadership role, than just their personal experiences.
And I can tell you from experience, the odds of these young men that robbed them, that this was their first offense, is almost zero. Generally speaking, first-time criminals do not commit armed robberies and carjackings. That's something you kind of graduate to after a period of time. So I would love to know, they did catch these guys. I would love to know what their criminal history looks like, and if they were perhaps previously committed violent crimes and let out, maybe too soon. Folks, if you are lamenting the lack of down-the-middle, sober, sane reporting on the Second Amendment, please go over to thereload.com and get a membership. Stephen is depending on your memberships to keep running his page, his channel, his podcast, all that sort of thing. The stuff is not cheap, and he needs your help doing it. Stephen, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week, buddy.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Hey, friends, this is John Correa. If you like the podcast, if it is bringing you value, do me a favor. Just rate the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us out.